Good morning, biology. Today we are going to be beginning our next chapter. This is our third chapter of the year. Don't let the number of the chapter mess with you. We don't follow our textbook numerically. We skip around slightly compared to how the book is organized. So we've covered chapter 1 and 2, and our third chapter is chapter 7. Chapter 7 is on cell structure and function. And so what this mainly is about is how a cell is put together and some of the jobs related to the parts of the cell. So you've probably gone into this in 7th grade, but it's been a while, and so hopefully some of the terminology sounds familiar, and it'll just be refreshing our minds as to what those things mean and what they do. First section is called the cell theory, and that would require us first to define what a cell is. A cell is defined as the smallest unit of any organism. Okay. Do not get this confused with an atom, which is the smallest unit of matter. So there we have to differentiate between a non-living thing and a living thing. So you can think of the cell as the basic unit of life. The smallest unit that displays those 7 or 8 characteristics of living things we talked about earlier this year. The discovery of the cell was made possible by the invention of the microscope, and the microscope was invented back in the 1500s, but that doesn't mean we saw cells right away either. Microscopes had to get better, they had to get more powerful, technology had to improve, and it took about 150 years. You can see in 1665, the first cell was seen. And the picture here in the corner of the screen is a sketch of what Robert Hooke saw. And so this is what he was looking at. He was looking at cork under one of the microscopes, and a thin section of cork. You guys know what cork is. We use them for plugging up ends of bottles, bulletin boards, even some footbeds of certain sandals and shoes. And so cork is just an old plant, right? An old, I think, tree. And so he was looking at the cross section of that, and he noticed all these little spaces, and it reminded him of jail cells. And so that's where the name cell actually came from. So a little fun fact on the naming of the cell. It was modeled after or influenced by jail cells. We also had a scientist with a similar name, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who was the first person to look in a microscope and see a small living thing there that wasn't visible with the naked eye. And he was looking at pond water and saw little things swimming around. Probably wasn't sure what they were, but could finally prove that there are things living and moving around that we don't see. Next, we'll talk about the cell theory. Here we have 3 pictures at the bottom. We'll talk about those first. On the left, we have some bacteria. Not all bacteria look like that, but bacteria can have a couple different shapes. In the center picture, we have a sunflower. And on the right picture, we have a strange-looking bird squawking at you, the ostrich. And so we look at the cell theory, and the cell theory has 3 parts. Number 1, all living things are made up of cells. Number 2, cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. And number 3, new cells are produced from existing cells. So living things are made of cells. A cell is that basic living structure. And the only way we get cells are from older cells. Now we might look at this and go, yeah, well, duh, right? We know these things. But the cell theory isn't, made up in the year 2020. Okay, so even though we take these things for granted, we got to go back in time a little bit. And so how did they come up with that theory? You can see when that theory kind of came to be. Great lesson on theories here, showing that it's not one person that comes up with something. It's the work of many scientists and discoveries that lead to these theories. And so a little less than 200 years ago, 3 scientists were credited with some of these main discoveries. So in 1838, Matthias Schleiden was able to show that all plants were made of cells. All known plants at that time were indeed made of cells. A year later, of course, we had somebody come to the conclusion that, well, if all plants are made of cells, how about animals? And so Theodor Schwann is credited with proving or showing that all known animals were made of cells. And about 16 years later, Rudolf Virchow showed that all cells come from existing cells. So cells didn't just spontaneously arise. In order for us to get a new living thing, we must get it from an old living thing or another living thing. And that kind of sets the tone for some other things we're going to learn about down the road here. So take a look at those names. You can tell Schleiden and Schwann. These were German scientists. And I believe Rudolf Virchow was Russian. All right. Leading into the division of the 2 kinds of cells, let's look at some size comparisons here. And we see 2 boxes indicated. And we'll talk about these words prokaryote and eukaryote. But notice some of the other things on this chart. Measurements. Ooh. Great. Okay, measurements. They show how a meter is 1,000 millimeters, which you probably know, but we can break down a millimeter into thousandths and then that micrometer into thousandths to get nanometers. So we're talking about some pretty small measurements here. But I don't know, let's start at the left side, I guess. We know atoms are the basic building block of matter. And so they're these smallest things that we are looking at here. Proteins, which we've talked about, are made of amino acids. So they're also very small. Mitochondria, chloroplast, nucleus, ribosomes. These are some of the cell parts that we're going to get to here next week. Notice viruses are also a really small thing. If you're ever wondering about the coronavirus or any of those other viruses, they're very tiny. And here we get into some of the smallest cells. So bacterial cells are some of the smallest cells. Here's some of the other smaller bacteria. And then we get into bigger cells, like your red blood cells, epithelial cells in your skin, your tissues. The human egg cell is actually a pretty large size cell. A frog and a chicken egg. And then, interestingly, some of these nerve cells in the human body and in other animals can be up to 1 meter in length. Now, can you see them? That's the question. Depends on the diameter. But we can see here, human eye, we actually can see these cells without a microscope. Some of these smaller structures here, we would need a microscope. And then to get to some of the things like viruses and atoms and bacteria, we would need what's called an electron microscope, which is a totally different concept from a light microscope. And we'll talk about microscopes next week. There'll be a future video on that. All right, what do all cells have? All cells, no matter whether they're a simple cell or a complex cell or a small cell or a big cell, are going to have 3 things. Number 1, DNA. They're going to have genetic material. They are living things. Number 2, a cell membrane, which is a thin, flexible barrier. And number 3, cytoplasm, which is a jelly-like interior of the cell. Kind of a liquidy, but kind of a thicker liquidy thing, very much like jelly or jello. Now take note, number 2 here, cell membrane. Okay, we're talking about a barrier on the outside of the cell. Okay, a lot of students mix up membrane, and they hear the last syllable of that, brain, and they think of like a brain in a human, a control center. You can't think that way. Your brain is spelled B-R-A-I-N. This is spelled B-R-A-N-E. Okay, we're talking membrane as a whole word here. That's a totally different thing. So we'll review that. We'll practice it. But just understand that the cell membrane is on the outside of the cell. All right, so let's sort out the 2 different kinds of cells we have. Here, this picture, if you look at this, a lot of people look at that and they say that it reminds them of character on SpongeBob. Was it Plankton, I think? This is just a basic cell, a simple cell, a bacterial cell, most likely. And a prokaryote is defined by having DNA, of course, but not found in a nucleus. So the DNA is not protected. It's not enclosed in anything. It's just found in that interior of the cell, in the cytoplasm. Usually these are smaller cells. They're usually much simpler, having less parts. Still exhibit all the characteristics of a living thing because they are a living entity. An example would be bacteria. So some of those smaller ones on the previous picture, we call these prokaryotes. Okay, and a good way to remember that, based on the Ed puzzle, they said pro rhymes with no, so no nucleus. In fact, what the name actually means, prokaryote translates to before nucleus. So they would be, evolutionarily, they were around prior to nucleated creatures, nucleated cells. The other kind of cell, which you're probably more familiar with, is a eukaryote. And we see a picture here on the screen. I'm sure you've all seen a similar diagram and maybe even noticed some of these words there. This should correlate very well with the color sheet that you are going to receive or have received. And eventually we're going to talk through all these parts. So don't let these big words scare you at the moment. We'll tackle these, separately. But this is a classic picture. Oop, jeez. Little sensitive there, the mouse. Classic picture of an animal cell. So a eukaryote is defined as a cell that does have a nucleus and the DNA is found in there. It is protected. So the DNA is contained almost like it's in a safe. Usually these are larger cells, usually more complex, not only in function, but in structure, dozens of structures, a lot more than in the previous picture of the prokaryote. Plant and animal cells are eukaryotes. So all the cells in your body, all the cells in the ostrich picture we saw, all the cells in the sunflower are eukaryotes. And eu rhymes with do. So it do have a nucleus. That doesn't sound very right? It does have a nucleus. So you do. In truth, what this translates to, eukaryote transfers to true nucleus. And so you rhymes with true too. If any of you want to make up a tongue twister about that, go right ahead. I would welcome that, and we can put it on my slides. So you, true, do, to. Please, somebody make one up. It's too early for me to do that. All right, thank you for watching. If you could complete the Google form called 7.1, the cell theory, that would be great. And we will see you soon.